Hello again, and welcome to part 3 of our series on developing a website from design to implementation in Drupal 8. And today we're going to be looking at setting up the grid and aligning our markup, which we set up in the last video, and having it aligned to the grid for the main sections. And in the next several videos, we're going to be aligning each of these sections independently and styling out the header, styling out the highlight. But for now, we're just going to be setting everything up and getting the core aligned to the grid. So let's take a look at our config.rb that we have set up for Compass. And we have it set up to require Suzy, which we're going to use for the grids, breakpoint, which we're going to use to craft our media queries for the responsive breakpoints. And we have a few path changes from the default Compass setup. We have our CSS stored in a folder called CSS. Our Sass will be in SCSS. Images will be in the Images folder. JavaScripts will be in the Scripts folder. And any fonts that we set up will be in Fonts. For now, we also have the output style for Sass to be expanded, and we're not going to be using the line comments, and we have the preferred syntax set to SCSS. So let's jump back over to our terminal window and go ahead and create these folders. The first is the CSS, and SCSS, images, scripts, and fonts. And you can see we've got all of those created here, and we're going to put our Sass in the SCSS folders. So let's take a look back at our index.html. And we have the style sheet set up that we're going to be using as style.css. So our main Sass file will be style.scss. Now we need to make a few folders to store our partials. So what I'm going to start with is I'm going to set up a collection that I'm going to call scaffolding. And I'm just going to store those in a folder. And in scaffolding, I'm going to create a partial called _scaffolding.scss. And let's refresh the file tree here. Go ahead and open our style.scss and import scaffolding. Now, since we're using the external libraries Suzy and Breakpoint, I'm going to create another file, and I'm going to call it _frameworks.scss. Since we are building to different frameworks, I'm going to go ahead and import those here. And I'm going to start with Compass. I'm going to import Suzy, and I'm going to import Breakpoint. One additional thing, Compass has a built-in reset, CSS reset. We are not going to be using that. I'm actually going to jump on here and grab normalize.css. And we're going to use that as an additional framework. So let me create a new folder here. And let me name that correctly. I'm going to store this as _normalize.scss. And we're just going to paste the contents of normalize.css into this file, and in our frameworks as the first import, we're going to import that into our project. Now we're importing the scaffolding, and the frameworks that we're going to be using. So let's jump back to our index.html, switch on the live preview, which at the moment will look exactly as it did before. But now as we jump back into our project and start Compass, and I'm in the wrong directory, so it's not going to do anything. compass should be creating the style sheet. And let me stop and restart the live preview. Occasionally it does get stuck and have some issues, and we can see that our fonts have changed. We're now using the sans serif font, and everything looks good for the basic setup. So next we're going to be looking at getting this configuration, this markup, to align in a similar fashion to this mock-up design that we have. And we're going to be doing this, but we don't actually need the mock-up on screen for this. So I'm just going to bring brackets back up here and shove it back over to the right-hand side. We do have a few classes that we have set up. We know that we have the full width class, and we're going to want those to be 100% wide, and we want them to float left. And this is just going to ensure that everything stacks up properly on the page, section by section. Next we have the grid row. And this will actually be a SUSE container, so we're going to include container here. Now for this we may want to go ahead and configure some of the SUSE global configuration, which in this pre-release version of SUSE that I'm using actually uses a SAS map for that. So we're going to be using a 12-column grid, and we're going to set the gutter width to be 1/4 of the column, so gutters 1/4. For now we're going to be using inside static gutter position, and we'll go in more in depth into the gutter positions in a future series on SUSE if anyone is interested, but it should work well for now, and we may end up changing this. And we're also going to, just for now, this is temporary, so I'm going to mark it as such, set the container to a 960 grid. And basically what this should do, if everything's working, it should contain all of our main grid rows within this 960 grid that we've just defined. And it looks to be working nicely, and I can go ahead and close normalize.css out there. Next, we're going to define a quick debug mix-in, and it's just going to be show outline. And what we're going to do is all elements contained within the element using the show outline mix-in will have an outline, 1 pixel solid black. And just to show how that works, I'm going to say header.site header. I'm just going to target the main header itself and include our show outline mix-in. Now all elements in the header, we do in fact see the outline for them, so when we get to styling that section, we can line it all up. So let's just go ahead and do that now. We're going to go ahead and target the root element that we created, and we're going to target it directly as div id root and move this into here. Now, Drupal does not have any classes called site header, so we're not really worried about namespace collisions or anything like that. We're just going to try to keep our code nested within this root element, because we should not have any code show up outside of this element at any point in time. So the first thing we're going to look at is the figure, and this contains the logo, which is an image, and this will probably end up being part of a mix-in or a style override, but figures have a margin on them with the normalize normalize.css. So I'm going to go ahead and reset that to 0, and everything should jump right to the top corner. And for our image, we want to make sure that our image is never wider or taller than the figure. So we're going to set the max width to 100% and the height to auto. And what that'll do is, as we resize the page, the image should shrink down and scale to the size of the figure. And that works nicely. And that's going to help us a bit when we start working on the responsive design. Next, we want to ensure that this figure, which I believe is contained within a block, we're not going to use the block to target, but we're going to actually target the figure.site logo. And I'm going to span this, I believe, 4 columns. And we want to use the nested grid so that we don't have an extra gutter. Okay, and that lines up nicely. Is that right? Oh, I realize what it is. Okay, and we have the navigation. And I'll target via the class shortly. But we have the unordered list, we have the list items, and here, that'll work a bit nicer. And then we have the anchors within. And again, we're going to override global anchor styles, but for this section, we're just going to go ahead and include those in the hierarchy here. Now, the navigation, we want to span the remaining 8 columns and nest that as well. Okay, that lines that up nicely. And we're also going to remove the list style from the list items. And we're going to remove margin and padding from the unordered list. Now that that fits, the next thing that we're going to do is set these to display as inline block items. And now everything fits nicely within the grid. So the only thing left to do with the navigation is to align the navigation items to the right, and we'll worry about styling and lining up the header in a future video. So now we can just remove this debug mix-in, and we'll go ahead and set the background color to a very dark gray, just to show some visible separation in the site header, and maximize this. So we see we've got a top header bar, we've got a full width wrapper around it, and we have all of these elements that fit nicely within that, within the header on the grid row. The next thing we're going to look at is taming this highlight section, which I believe just has the class of site highlight. And let's jump back over to the SAS file. And in here, I'm going to target that. And we're going to include our show outline mix-in. So now we should get outlines on each of those sections. And again, the figure, we have a margin of 0 set on that. Let's actually set this for any figure within the root with an override there, and we'll go ahead and set padding on those to 0 as well. And that's something that will actually likely change when we go to refactor and clean up this style sheet a bit. But now we can see that our figure is over on the left of the actual container, and that's not exactly what we want, but for the most part, this area will be managed by the jQuery slideshow anyway, so why don't we set the max height, or no, I'm sorry, we'll just set the height of the highlight section to 480 pixels, and we'll set the figure to display none for now, and we'll style that a bit later. So now we don't have anything in the show outline section, so what we'll do is set the background color of this to a lighter gray for now, again to show some visible separation in the sections of the site. Next, we're going to tackle this primary content section. We've basically got a main and an aside for the sidebar, and that's going to be fairly easy, fairly quick to style. I believe I have that called Site Primary Content. I do. So I'm just going to grab that, copy, and paste into another selector. And we have a main, and we have an aside. And we're just going to align this main section. It's going to be 8 columns, and we're going to specify that this is nested so that we don't have an additional gutter margin on the section itself. And as we align that, our aside has sort of split between these two sections since there's room for it over on the right now. But we don't want it to be jumping around, so we'll go ahead and include a span of 4, and this is nested as well, and that should push everything nicely over to the right. Now, we don't necessarily want a background color on the primary content section of the website, but for now I am going to include the show outline mix-in, just so that we can see how everything's lining up. And everything looks great, so we're going to move on. Down below in the, what did I call this? The site feature ticker. And we have 3 articles in there, so we're going to select those by the HTML element. Site feature ticker, article, and these are just going to span 4 columns. That was easy enough, and that should do it for that section. We're going to go ahead and move this outline to this section just to verify how everything's lining up, and it looks right. Everything looks good there. So we're going to set the background color of this to the same gray that we have set on the slideshow. And we're going to change this to use variables later on, but for now this will do. And finally, for laying out the skeleton, we have the site footer, and this is just a footer.site footer, but I believe I'm just going to use the class to stay consistent here. And I'm going to include our show outline mix-in. And you can see we have a mess of outlines, but this will all clean up nicely when I tell it that each of these blocks will be 3 columns wide. So we're using the nested block. We're not using the global block class. And this is going to collide with Drupal, so we need to rename this. We need to refactor this. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this. Rename these classes in markup. And I'm going to tag this with Drupal collision. Okay, so each of these will span 3 columns, and that should clean this entire footer section up. And it does. Everything looks nice. We'll go ahead and set the background color to the same as the header. And now we can remove our outlines. And that does it for the skeleton of the page. So let's compare this with our mock-up. And again, we have the full width header, we have the logo, we have our links, we have the slideshow section, we have main content, we have the sidebar, aside content, search box, we have the feature ticker, we have the copyright, legal information, offsite, address, we have the contact form, and then we have the footer, navigation, and we'll style each of these sections individually in later videos. So, again, that's going to do it for this video. I've been Glenn with Asylum 7 Studios, and just as a reminder again, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to leave us a comment, and we will try to get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you in the next one.